The floor manager snatched the water glass from Clover's hand before it reached the bar. "He doesn't have a reservation," Odette Breyer said. Her voice was the kind of quiet that carried anyway. "Ask him to leave." Clover Watts looked at the man sitting at the end of the bar. He was in his late 70s, maybe older, the kind of age that settled in the hands first. In the careful way he set his cardigan pocket flat, in the small effort it took him to lift his eyes. He hadn't asked for a table. He hadn't asked for anything. He'd simply sat down, placed a worn canvas hat on the counter beside him, and waited with the patience of someone who'd learned that patience was all he'd been given. Clover set the glass down herself. "He can have a glass of water, Odette. This is the Gilded Room, not a rest stop. Then I'll pay for it out of pocket." Odette's expression tightened into something practiced, not anger exactly, more like a category error she was forced to correct. She looked at Clover, the way she always looked at Clover, a brief inventory of everything that didn't fit. The extra weight, the sensible shoes, the uniform that never quite hung the same as on the younger girls. Clover was used to that look. She'd been reading balance sheets long enough to know when a number had already been written off. She carried the water to the old man anyway. He looked up. His eyes were dark and steady, not confused the way some people expected old eyes to be, but clear in the particular way of someone who'd seen enough to stop being surprised by most of it. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." Clover folded her hands against her apron. "Can I get you anything else? Coffee, maybe? We have a good dark roast." "Black," he said, "if it's no trouble." "None at all." She brought it. He wrapped both hands around the mug, the way you do when you've been cold for a while, and the warmth isn't guaranteed to last. Clover went back to the books she kept behind the bar, the visible ones. Not the ones she updated in a separate ledger she kept in a fireproof box under her bed. The Gilded Room's numbers were complicated in ways that weren't her business to ask about. Clover's job was to make the math add up. She was very good at making math add up. The old man stayed for 40 minutes. He drank 2 cups of coffee. He tipped $3 on a drink that cost nothing, leaving the bills in a careful stack with the coins on top. When he left, Odette watched him go with visible relief. Clover watched him and thought about her grandmother. His name was Edmund. She didn't know his last name for the first 2 weeks. He came back on a Tuesday, then again the following Friday. Always the same cardigan, navy, with a small pull at one elbow. Always the same seat at the end of the bar, away from the main room, close to the service door where the noise was manageable. Always alone. He never asked for a table, never pushed for anything more than a cup of coffee and 10 or 15 minutes of quiet. Once, when the lunch crowd thinned and Clover was rechecking a column she'd carried wrong, he told her she'd made a face at the ledger that reminded him of his late wife doing crossword puzzles. She'd get 1 clue from the across and about 6 wrong, he said, made the same expression. Did she ever finish them? Never, but she filled in every square. Clover wrote her correction in the margin. Smart woman. Edmund smiled. It changed his face entirely. Younger, suddenly, the lines rearranging themselves into something warmer than the careful neutrality he wore when he first sat down. Odette watched these exchanges with increasing displeasure, the way you watch a door left open in winter. "You're encouraging him," she said one afternoon. Clover didn't look up. "He orders coffee and tells me about his wife. I'm not sure what I'd be discouraging. He's using up a seat. The bar is empty. It might not be. Then I'll move him when it isn't." Odette left without answering. She had a talent for ending conversations by simply walking away from them, as though the exit itself were a verdict. The 3rd week, Edmund came in on a Wednesday with a folded piece of paper. He smoothed it against the bar and looked at it for a long moment before he spoke. It's a discharge summary, he said. From my cardiologist, I don't. He stopped. The print is very small. Clover set down her pen. She read it to him. Not quickly, not in the summarizing way doctors used when they didn't want to answer questions. Slowly, section by section, stopping when he raised his hand, going back when he asked her to repeat something. It took 22 minutes. She watched his face move through the information. The medication adjustments, the follow-up schedule, the line about moderate activity, the longer line about what moderate meant for a man his age with his particular measurements. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "My son usually does this. He's been," a small pause, "he's been busy." "You don't have anyone else to call?" Edmund folded the paper back along its creases. "I didn't want to bother anyone." Clover thought about that on the train home. She thought about it enough that she missed her stop. She was in the middle of reconciling October's receivables when the front doors opened and the room changed. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody announced anything, but the two men who came through first weren't dining guests. They moved differently, eyes already on the corners, shoulders oriented to block exits rather than find them. Then, the man behind them entered, and the room shifted the way it does when something large and quiet walks into it, like a drop in barometric pressure you feel before you understand. Clover had heard the name Danton Cray since her first month at the Gilded Room. She'd heard it in numbers, mostly, in the accounts that balanced too neatly, in the columns that appeared, without invoices, in the name on the LLC that owned the LLC that owned this building. She hadn't attached it to a face. Now she did. He was tall. Dark suit, no tie. The kind of still that wasn't calm exactly, but rather the absence of anything unnecessary. His eyes moved through the room in the same efficient way his men did, but slower, more deliberate, as though cataloguing rather than scanning. They stopped on the bar. On Edmund. Edmund raised one hand. Cray crossed the floor. His men stayed near the entrance. He stopped in front of the old man and studied him for a moment, with an expression Clover couldn't easily read. Relief and something more complicated underneath it. Worry that had been running long enough to learn how to walk. "Dad." "She gave me coffee," Edmund said. He didn't indicate Clover so much as orient slightly in her direction, the way you do when you mean to include someone who's been standing just outside a conversation. "Both times I came in, and she read me the discharge papers last week when the print was too small." Danton turned. Clover realized she was still holding her pen. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the room, complete attention, nothing spared, nothing performed. She was aware of herself in a way she usually tried not to be. The extra weight she'd learned to carry forward in her shoulders, the uniform that wasn't designed for her body, the careful blankness she kept on her face in rooms where she'd already calculated that she wasn't the point. "You work here," he said. "Bookkeeper," she said, "and sometimes the bar when it's slow." "Your name?" "Clover Watts." He said it once, quietly, like he was adding it somewhere specific. Odette materialized from the direction of the host stand, already smoothing her jacket. "Mr. Cray, I was just about to." "Leave the room." The three words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Odette left. The rest of that afternoon had the particular quality of things moving faster than they appeared to. Two senior servers were spoken to briefly and quietly. The dining room manager received a phone call he didn't want. Clover stood where she'd been standing and answered Danton's questions. Not many, and not unkind, but the kind of questions that don't leave room for embellishment. How long had Edmund been coming in? What had the staff said to him? Had anyone asked him to leave? She answered honestly. She left out the part where she'd paid for the first coffee herself, because that didn't seem relevant. Edmund sat at the bar through all of it, drinking a third cup. He watched Danton the way fathers watch adult children handle difficult things, with the particular vigilance of someone who no longer has the authority to intervene, but still can't quite stop wanting to. Before Cray left that evening, he came back to the bar. "I'll handle the situation here," he said. Clover looked at him. "I know you will. I just—" She paused. He waited. The other servers. They followed Odette's lead. Most of them didn't understand what they were doing. I don't think they should lose their jobs over someone else's call. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not softening exactly, more like recalibration. "You're asking for leniency, for people who walked past my father. I'm asking you to give people the chance to understand what they did before you remove them for it. There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment. "There is," he said. He left. Edmund finished his coffee, tipped his usual careful stack of bills, and gave Clover a small nod before he went. She stood at the bar for a moment after the door closed, looking at nothing in particular. Then she went back to the receivables. The next morning, Odette was gone. That much Clover had expected. What she hadn't expected was Diane Foss, a hostess who'd worked the Gilded Room for 6 years, waiting for Clover in the coat room with the particular expression of someone rehearsing an accusation. "You knew," Diane said. "You knew who he was when you started giving him coffee." Clover hung her coat. "I didn't know his last name until yesterday. You have access to every account in this building. Accounts don't have photographs. You're smart. Everyone knows you're smart. You figured it out." Clover turned. She was taller than Diane by 3 inches, something that surprised people who decided not to look at her. "Diane, you have been at this bar every day for 6 years. Edmund came in 3 times a week for 3 weeks. Did you ever bring him water?" The silence was its own answer. "I didn't figure anything out," Clover said. "I just didn't decide he wasn't worth the coffee." She went to her books. The rumor spread anyway. It moved through the staff the way these things did, growing cleaner and more certain with each retelling, acquiring detail it hadn't started with. By Thursday, some version of Clover had befriended Edmund deliberately, had researched the Cray name, had been working an angle her colleagues were now embarrassed not to have spotted. By Friday, the story had the settled quality of things people repeat often enough to believe. Clover heard enough to understand the shape of it. She didn't correct anyone. Danton heard it too. He came in on a Thursday afternoon, alone this time, no men at the entrance, which somehow made his presence more noticeable rather than less. He found her at the end of the bar with her ledger. "The story going around," he said. "I know. You're not addressing it." "No." "Why not?" Clover set her pen down. "Because anyone who's already decided I'm calculating isn't asking a real question. They're looking for confirmation. I'm not going to perform innocence for a jury that made up its mind before I testified." Danton said nothing. He looked at her for a moment with that complete, unhurried attention she was learning not to flinch from. "My father wants to see you tomorrow," he said. "He'll be here at noon." "I'll be here." He left. Clover picked up her pen. She noticed her hand was steadier than she expected. Edmund came at noon as promised. He sat at his usual seat and waited for her to bring the coffee without asking. She brought it, sat down on the other side of the bar. "Tell me something," he said. "About what? Why?" He wrapped his hands around the mug. "You don't know me. I'm not particularly remarkable to look at. I didn't tell you anything useful the first time. So why?" Clover was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother worked kitchens for 60 years, she said. Not places like this. Diners, cafeteria lines, a school cafeteria toward the end. She was the kind of woman everybody noticed when she was strong. When her hands worked and her hearing was good and she could stand a full shift without sitting down. She looked at the ledger without seeing it. When she got older, people stopped seeing her. Servers talked to me instead of her at tables where she was the one paying. Doctors explained her own blood work to me while she sat right there. Strangers pushed past her in stores like she hadn't arrived yet. Edmund listened without moving. She told me once that the worst part wasn't being old, Clover said. It was being erased before she died. She looked up. I couldn't stop time for her. I couldn't fix her joints or her hearing or make people remember she was still in the room. But I could see her. A small pause. So when I see someone being made invisible, I don't join the crowd, pretending not to notice. That's the only promise I kept for her. The room was very quiet. Edmund's expression had changed in the way of things that move slowly, but go very deep. I came here because a colleague recommended the place, he said after a moment. I didn't tell Danton where I was going. I don't always. He turned the mug in his hands. He worries. He thinks that if he builds enough walls, nothing old and difficult can get inside them. He's wrong. But he's a good son, and I let him believe it works because it makes him feel useful. Clover smiled despite herself. My wife and I used to come to places like this when Danton was young, Edmund said. We couldn't afford it, but she liked to dress up and pretend we could. She said the food tasted better when you sat up straight. He smiled. She was probably right. They stayed at the bar for an hour. He told her about Eleanor, the crossword puzzles, the terrible singing, the way she laughed at her own jokes before she reached the punchline. Clover told him about her grandmother's biscuits, which required a specific temperature and a specific aluminum pan and a specific and deeply personal amount of ignoring the recipe. When he stood to leave, he put his hand briefly on hers on the counter, not dramatic, just there. She sat with it for a moment after he'd gone. Danton had been near the service corridor for the last 15 minutes of that conversation. He hadn't come inside. He'd stopped at the half-open door and found himself unwilling to interrupt something he couldn't easily name. His father's voice, low and unhurried. Clover's voice, quieter than usual. The particular sound a room makes when two people in it have stopped performing for anyone. Edmund laughed 3 times. Danton counted, because he'd been counting for months without meaning to. The gap between his father's laughter, the widening distance between the man Cray remembered, and the man who'd grown careful and small inside a house built to keep everything out. He left before they saw him. He drove back across the city and sat at his desk without opening anything. He had spent 12 years constructing something impenetrable. The name Cray now opened doors it had once been turned away from. His father would never again be redirected to the wrong entrance, would never again be assessed and found wanting by someone with a clipboard and a guest list. Danton had made certain of that, with the kind of methodical, cold-blooded certainty he applied to everything he decided mattered. But last Wednesday, his father had been sitting at the wrong end of a bar being asked to leave, and a woman in sensible shoes had brought him coffee and read him his discharge papers, and remembered, 3 weeks later, exactly how he took it. Power hadn't done that. Money hadn't done that. 12 years of building walls hadn't done that. Danton sat with the discomfort of that for a long time, which was not something he was accustomed to allowing. The full staff gathering happened on a Monday. Edmund had asked for it. Danton had arranged it the same afternoon, without asking why, which was the shorthand of men who understood each other's weight precisely. Every employee of the Gilded Room stood in the main dining room at 9 o'clock. The servers, the kitchen staff, the runners, the replacement host team. Clover stood near the back with her ledger, under her arm out of habit. Edmund walked in wearing a charcoal suit. Clover had only ever seen him in the cardigan. The suit changed the room, not because it announced wealth, though it did, but because it placed him. People who'd looked through him for 3 weeks were now doing the calculation they should have run from the start, and the numbers were uncomfortable. Danton stood beside him. He didn't speak yet. Edmund looked at the assembled room with an expression that wasn't angry and wasn't magnanimous. It was tired, specifically and honestly tired, the way you get when you've seen the same thing many times and hoped each time would be different. "I have been coming to this establishment for 3 weeks," he said. "I chose not to identify myself. I chose not to announce my connection to the ownership or to my son." He paused. "I wanted to understand something simple. How does a room full of capable, trained professionals treat a person when there is nothing visible to gain from treating them well?" Nobody moved. "I learned that this room is very good at courtesy," Edmund continued. "Excellent, in fact. Your service is polished, your presentation professional, your attention to certain guests remarkable." He looked across the tables. The word certain is doing considerable work in that sentence. He described being redirected to the bar rather than a table, being offered menus for a section that wasn't open, being asked, once, whether he was waiting for someone, in the particular tone of a question that is actually a suggestion to leave. He described not being brought water. "One person in this building," Edmund said, "brought me water, not because she was asked, not because I was sitting there." His eyes moved briefly toward the back of the room, toward Clover. "She read me a medical document I was too proud to admit I couldn't pass. She told me how I took my coffee. She told me I'd calculated the tip wrong and fixed it in her head while holding a full conversation." He paused. "When she found out who I was, she asked my son not to punish the people who hadn't done any of those things. That surprised me more than anything else." Several people lowered their eyes. "I'm not interested in punishing embarrassment," Edmund said, "but I am interested in this room understanding something before today is over." He let the silence hold. "Every person you walked past this month deciding they didn't matter, they mattered. They mattered before I walked through that door. They will matter the next time you make that decision. The only variable was whether you'd ever have to know." When Danton spoke, his voice was quiet enough that everyone went still to hear it. "Staff conduct policies are being updated effective today. Some positions have changed as of this morning." He looked at the dining room manager briefly, who had understood for several days that he was living on borrowed time. "For everyone remaining, you know what changed this morning. I'd recommend not forgetting it by next week." 3 people left. The room resettled around the ones who stayed, with the particular quiet of people taking stock of themselves. Clover remained near the back until it cleared. Edmund came to find her. "You don't look satisfied," he said. "I'm not dissatisfied," she said. She looked toward where the manager had been standing. "I wanted it to stop. I didn't need to watch." Edmund nodded slowly. There was something in his face that wasn't quite a smile, more like recognition. Danton had heard every word. He stood near the entrance with his hands in his pockets and watched Clover Watts stand in the room, where she'd been overlooked for a month, and find nothing in the morning's events worth enjoying. He had been in many rooms with many people, at moments when the balance finally shifted. He knew exactly how most of them behaved when it did. This was different from all of them. The offer came 4 days later. Edmund arrived at noon. He sat at the bar. He placed a folded card on the counter without preamble. Clover looked at it without picking it up. "That looks official." "It is. Official things tend to be expensive." "This one is an offer," Edmund said. "My son wrote the terms, but the position was my idea, so blame me first and him second." She opened the card. Edmund wanted her to manage his affairs, his appointment calendar, his correspondence, his medical paperwork, the translation work, as he described it, the converting of complicated information into language that moved at a human pace. She would accompany him to appointments when she was willing. She would share meals with him on a schedule they negotiated. She would, he had noted in handwriting below Danton's typescript, not under any circumstances permit more than 2 teaspoons of sugar in his coffee without a compelling medical argument from an accredited physician. The salary was significant. Clover barely registered the number. "You want a companion," she said. "I want someone to talk to who argues back," Edmund said. "You're the only person I've found lately who can do that without appearing to calculate the risk first." Danton appeared from the corridor beside the bar. He'd been there, she realized, for several minutes at minimum. She was beginning to understand that he had a habit of being in the same building as his father without announcing it. "There's one condition," he said. She looked at him. "You're not performing a service. You're not managing appearances." His voice was direct in the way she'd learned to read as honest rather than cold. "My father doesn't need agreement. He needs presence. The position exists because you already provided it." Clover looked at Edmund. "I have conditions too," she said. Edmund's expression brightened considerably. "I assumed. I keep my books. The accounting stays. Acceptable. I don't adjust what I say because of the name attached to this building. Preferable, in fact. And I'm not calling either of you by your last name." Danton made a sound that occupied the same space as a laugh without quite becoming one. Edmund looked like a man who had just won something he'd been patient about for a long time. "Done," he said. She said yes. What changed and what didn't could have been predicted by anyone paying attention. Edmund began referring to Clover's office as the real office, which made her actual office feel like a formality. He appeared there regularly to provide unsolicited opinions about her filing system. She returned unsolicited opinions about his dietary choices. This showed no sign of stopping. Danton began adjusting his schedule. He was not, by anyone's account, a man who adjusted schedules. His calendar was architectural, structured, load-bearing, not a single element optional. But dinners started running long. He started appearing on nights when the most compelling reason to be in the building was the conversation happening at the corner table, where Edmund was explaining to Clover why the chess opening she'd suggested was historically flawed. He sent a car for her during a heavy rain because she'd mentioned, once, 3 weeks earlier, that she hated waiting for the train in bad weather. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it. She wrote it in the place. She kept things that mattered and moved on. One night she came in at 11 to finish a quarterly report and found Danton at the bar with a plate of bread and an unopened bottle of wine. He looked up. She looked at the bread. "Hard week," she said. "Routine week. Some of them are just heavier than they look." She sat down across from him. He pushed the bread toward her. She took a piece. Neither of them spoke for a moment, which was the particular variety of silence that doesn't need filling. "My father told me what you said," Danton said, "about giving dignity forward." Clover looked up. "I spent a long time building something I thought would protect him from rooms like this one, from people deciding what he was worth based on what they could see." He turned his glass on the bar. "I believed if I became powerful enough, if the name meant enough, nobody would ever miscalculate him again." "Sometimes that works," Clover said. "It didn't. You did." She didn't reach for an easy answer. She found she didn't want one. "You can't protect everyone from every room," she said. "I can't either, but you can decide, every time, not to be the person who looked away." She picked up another piece of bread. "That doesn't require power. It just requires deciding." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the bar, at the space between them, and said, "This stopped being about gratitude some time ago." The room was very quiet. Her first instinct was familiar, to say something small and careful, the kind of thing she'd learned to say in rooms where she'd already determined she wasn't the point. She set that instinct aside with both hands. "I know," she said. He reached across the bar. She let him take her hand. He held it carefully, the way Edmund held his coffee mug, like warmth that wasn't guaranteed and was worth having regardless. She didn't move away. When she looked up, he was watching her with the same attention he'd had from the first evening, that total, unhurried presence that had felt like an examination for so long, and now felt unmistakably like something else. She covered his hand with both of hers. He closed his eyes briefly, which was the most unguarded she had ever seen Danton Cray. She understood it was not nothing, that a man who'd spent 12 years being unreadable would close his eyes. She stayed. Edmund's 78th birthday fell on a Sunday. There was a dinner, not a party. Edmund had been clear about that, but a long table, family, and a few people who had earned the word over time. Clover arrived early to argue with the florist about the centerpiece which Edmund later referred to as her most meaningful contribution to the evening. She sat beside Edmund. Danton sat beside her. Halfway through the second course, a server in his second week leaned toward a colleague and whispered something that Edmund, with the hearing he regularly claimed was ruined, heard completely. He set down his fork. "Come here," he said. The young man came to the table. Edmund looked at him without hurry. "The first time this woman and I met," Edmund said, gesturing toward Clover, "I was sitting at the wrong end of a bar in a cardigan, hoping someone might offer me a glass of water." He paused. "She brought coffee, black, without being asked, without knowing anything about me, except that I was there and nobody else was moving." The server nodded carefully. "She also told me I was leaving the wrong tip and recalculated it in her head while holding a full conversation." Edmund's eyes moved to Clover, warm and sure. What she did not do, the important part, the only part that matters, was decide before she knew a single thing about me that I wasn't worth the cup. Clover looked at the roses in the centerpiece. Edmund had overruled the florist's recommendation of orchids. She had thought at the time that this was a perfectly reasonable hill to die on. "Character," Edmund said, turning back to the table, "does not require an audience. It doesn't require information about last names, or what someone's son does for a living, or what number appears in their account." He raised his glass. "It requires only that when a person is in front of you, you see them, before you know anything else. Just see them." Around the table, glasses rose. Danton did not look at the room. He looked at Clover, who was pressing her lips together in the particular way she did when she decided that crying was not currently on the schedule and was overriding it by sheer accounting. Under the table, he took her hand. She held on. The table was full and warm, and Edmund was already expanding the story by 30% in the retelling, and somewhere in the city outside these walls, the name Cray meant whatever it had always meant: power and weight and rooms that fell quiet when it entered them. But at this table, it meant something else as well. Something quieter and harder to build and worth considerably more. It meant a family that had been assembled from an unexpected direction, held together not by blood or obligation, but by the simple, repeatable, endlessly difficult act of seeing a person before you knew what they were worth. Edmund raised his glass a second time. Nobody had asked him to. He looked at Clover across the candlelight. She looked back. And the woman who had once made herself small enough to be invisible in every room she entered sat at the head of a family table, holding the hand of the most feared man in the city, and understood, for the first time in a long time, that she had always belonged somewhere. She had just needed someone to see her first.